Hi guys, what's going on? It's Kaiger 1234 up today with a continuation of the reading we've been doing. We are continuing with our reading. We are of course reading the Essential Poe, a guide of Edgar Allan Poe stories. Of course, this is where we sit back and relax and do a little bit of reading for you. Of course, I want you all to just be relaxed and get a drink or something, perhaps a cup of tea, some biscuits. I have my drink here. I'm drinking lemon ice, Relentless, of course. Perhaps not the healthiest of drinks, but a very refreshing drink nonetheless. We are going to continue today. We are reading the introduction to this book. Last time we read the chronology of his life, but I feel we should read the introduction as well. There's how many pages do we have? We have about 5-6 pages to read. I don't want to let this intro go on for too long. We're going to try and get these introduction read, and then of course next time we will start with the poems. So without further ado, sit back, relax and listen to the more introductions of some more information on the man himself of Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, I'll let you get relaxed now, and of course let's get straight into it. Introduction. Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston on a bitter winter's day in January 1809. But in a larger sense, Poe was an orphan in the storm of life, pursued by poverty and misfortune until the date of his early death. Quote, "I do believe God gave me a spark of genius," he once wrote, "but he quenched it in misery. He was born wretched since his mother, Eliza Poe, suffered from tuberculosis even as she carried him. In the same year as his father, David Poe, absconded from the household, Eliza herself died. The young Edgar was adopted at the age of 4 by a well-meaning couple who really did not understand the character of the chosen infant. The Allens lived in Richmond, Virginia, so that the young Poe was raised as a child of the South. He never lost his southern gentility. That winning combination of formality and grace, and in part of his imagination was formed by the southern taste for grandiloquence and grotesquerie. I lost where I was. Yeah, the winning combination of formality and grace, and in his part imagination was formed by the southern taste for grandiloquence and grotesquerie. He was partly raised by slaves, and it has been said that his affection for the macabre springs from his memory of their stories. Sorry, I sometimes lose where I'm reading. I'm not the best reader in the world, but I'm trying my best. He had a more orthodox education in the schools of the South. There was one hiatus when his adoptive father, John Allan, crossed the Atlantic to start a new business. Poe spent 5 years in England and was educated at a school in Stoke Newington before the family sailed back to the United States. On his return, he attended Richmond Academy, where he began writing poetry. Poe always wanted to be, before anything else, a pre-eminent poet. He considered his prose writing to be an excuse to make money, of course. At the age of 17, he was enrolled at the new University of Virginia at Charlottesville. This is where his trouble started. We know, of course, his life was filled with misery. He gambled too much and drank too much. He had a moderate thirst for learning, and acquainted himself as well as a student of Latin and French. But he also had a keen appetite for alcohol in large quantities, of course. His gambling debts multiplied, and John Allan refused to honour them. He also refused to let his fiancée finance and any further course of studies, and so the young Poe left the Allan household forever. At the age of 18, he set sail on a coaling vessel to Boston. He persuaded a young publisher in that city to print 50 copies of Tamerlane and other poems. That included most of his verse to date, but the newly published poet then embarked upon another career altogether. He enlisted in the United States Army. It was on the face of it surprising decision, but it's possible that Poe needed and actively sought a life of formal discipline in order to mitigate the inward chaos that he sensed. The military life did indeed seem to suit him, since he was promoted to Sergeant Major before seeking an honourable discharge in order to pursue cadetship at the illustrious Military Academy at West Point. Just going to have another little drink here, of course. I think the cat likes my reading. He was accepted there, and thus enters American literary history as the only writer of original genius who ever went to West Point. Yet he grew weary of the strict regimen at the academy. He began drinking heavily again, and eventually engineered his own departure by what was described as a court-martial as gross neglect of duty. He took his army greencoat with him and migrated to New York. He no doubt wished to find work there as a writer or as a teacher, but he had no success in either field. 3 months later he moved to Baltimore in Maryland to be close with his paternal relatives. They were the only family left to him. Poe moved in with his aunt Maria Clem and her younger daughter Virginia. It was at the beginning of a household that would endure, albeit shakily, until the time of Poe's death. This was also the period in which his prose work for the first published in the literary magazines. Then one of these early stories, MS Found in a Bottle, was awarded the prize of $50, a lot of money back then. Poe had at last found his profession in the summer of 1833. He was offered the position of an editor on the Southern Literary Messenger. It was fortuitously based in Richmond, Poe's original home, and so with Maria and Virginia Clem he set up a home in the city he already knew too well. He also took the precaution of marrying Virginia, although she was only 13 at the time. A bit weird by today's standards, but back in those days that was kind of a common thing. In the Messenger he published some of the most famous tales, among them Bernice and The King's Pest. In these stories, created by the prose poetry of morbidity and suffering by which he is best known, the narratives dwell upon the macabre, but they are infected with journalistic sensationalism that helps to season a characteristic mixture of death and a perverse passion. In his work, death and beauty are the only two faces of the same primeval deity, to be once worshipped and feared. His reputation was in fact already growing, and he was advised to attempt a novel in the 2 volumes. He promptly accepted the advice and produced the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, and it was subtitled as a story of incredible adventures and discoveries, all of them imbued with Poe's own obsessions and all the strange restless excitability of his own nature. That excitability took to its distinct forms, and his old habit of intemperance began to affect his fortunes. His work on the Messenger had been interrupted by binges, after which he might spend several days in bed. This was not what the proprietor of the magazine had in mind when he hired him. So the newly married Poes, together with Maria Clem, decamped for New York before moving on to Philadelphia. By the end of 1833, he professed to be desperately poor, but then, by a stroke of singular good fortune, he was hired by an editorial assistant on the Gentleman's Magazine. In that capacity, he proved himself to be a querulous and excentric critic of contemporary literature. He knew himself to be superior in the hack writers around him, and demonstrated as much in some of his finest tales, William Wilson and the Fall of the House of Usher, published in the Gentleman's Magazine itself. A collection of his stories was then published in volume form, and there were already some reviewers ready to hail at his genius in the art of horror and the macabre, but literary success did not elevate his life of poverty. The same patterns of anxiety and hopelessness seemed to appear in his life, with the now inevitable slide into heavy drinking. He was sacked once more, only to be re-employed as the editor of the book reviews in the newly formed Graham's magazine. In that journal there then appeared The Murders of Rue Morgue and A Descent into the Maelstrom. The former has become known as the harbinger of modern detective story, in which C. Augustus Dupin solves a strange mystery through a process of deduction and elimination, and in it is pertinent that Arthur Conan Doyle should praise Poe as father of the detective tale. At the beginning of 1842, Virginia Poe manifested in the first signs of tuberculosis. His young wife was now dying from the same disease that killed his mother. His grief was insupportable, and he would wander through the streets in despair. In the crisis of anxiety and despondency, he was once again drinking very heavily. He resigned once more probably was dismissed from Graham's magazine, and the Poe family had moved to a smaller house in Philadelphia. His poverty soon became widely known, and a subscription fund was established for the family's relief. He also tried to help himself by embarking upon a series of lectures, but then he decided to try to revive his career in some journalism by returning to New York. He did in fact score a palpable hit in the city soon after his arrival, with the publication in the New York Sun of an entirely imaginary account of a journey across the Atlantic in a balloon. It was later entitled The Balloon Hoax, but at the time it was believed to be a true account of an actual event, kind of like the War of the Worlds thing. The citizens of New York were wildly enthusiastic, and the edition of the newspaper was sold out. Here, in the Balloon Hoax, many seemed to see the seed of science fiction story. There was a further success at the beginning of 1845. A poem entitled The Raven, probably the most famous of them all, was published in the Evening Mirror. It was Poe's first successful verse, with a refrain of "Nevermore." It became a sensation. It was quoted everywhere. It was mentioned on the theatrical stage. Poe was immediately in great demand at literary saloons and other gatherings, dressed always in a black suit, with a black frock coat and a black cravat. He recited the gloomy poem with great pathos. Flushed by the success, he joined the staff of the Broadway Journal. The Poe household had moved into a cottage in Fordham, a village 13 miles to the north of New York. It was there that at the beginning of 1847, Virginia Poe died. The effect upon Poe was immediate and catastrophic. He wrote that for several weeks he was deprived of all power and thought or action. Yet slowly, with the help of Maria Clem, he recovered his strength. He even harboured plans for the future. He pursued the scheme of editing a new literary periodical. He gave the lecture upon the origin and nature of the universe that was subsequently published in a volume form as Eureka. In this period, too, he published two of his most famous poems, Eulaum and The Bells, which come as close as possible to the status of pure and sound poetry without any definitive and discernible meaning. Soon after the death of his wife, Poe was seeking once more for female protection and companionship. Other than that he afforded by Maria Clem, he pursued several suitable ladies with expressions of undying love, only to retreat when they came too close to him. He was excitable, almost hysterical, breaking down on several occasions from combined effect of alcohol and ill health. In his last year, 1849, he travelled back to the city of Richmond in an attempt to resume a relationship with a wealthy widow, Elmira Shelton, which he had known and possibly loved in youth. She was not necessarily immune to his charms, but the prospect of happiness was snatched away from both parties. Edgar Allan Poe died on October 1847 in Baltimore Hospital. He had travelled from Richmond to Baltimore en route to New York, where he had some literary business to consider. A week after his departure, he was found in a confused, tremulous state in a Baltimore bar. He was wearing someone else's clothes and was not coherent. His condition was such that later he was taken to a local hospital, where he died 3 days later. He was only 40 years old. Poe enjoyed a measure of fame in his lifetime, but his enduring literary reputation was established after his death. W.B. Yeats declared that he was the greatest of American poets, and Tennyson described him as one of the most original geniuses that America had ever produced. His poetry and prose were proclaimed by the French poets Baudelaire and Mallarme, while he excited the admiration of diverse writers as diverse as Nietzsche and Kafka, Dostoevsky and Joyce. He had hailed the true original, indeed, an author who had invented the genres of science fiction, science, fantasy and detective fiction, while at the same time bringing the tales of sensation and the horror to the highest point. I trust that this selection will afford proof of his greatness. Poe's own idiosyncratic spelling and punctuation have, for the purposes of authenticity, have been retained. Peter Ackroyd. So, there we have it. The introduction to this book in question, of course, we found a little bit more about Edgar Allan Poe's life there, of course. Quite a miserable life when you think about it. Lots of relationships, again, failing, and a horrible way to die from such a young age, filled with tragedy, of course. Of course, if there's any moral to his life that we can learn from, is that alcohol is never the way. And if I want to get a message across, is that alcohol is something that we shouldn't take for granted. Of course, people out there drink alcohol too much these days, and of course, back in these days, you didn't really have the help that we need. People like that were considered to be either just drunks or insane people, and of course the help wasn't there. But I just want to say that if you have any problems with drinking too much, or you drink to maintain or drown your sorrows, I highly recommend that you get some help. There is help out there, of course. There's all sorts of people that you can talk to, and of course there's always help. And if that's anything that we can learn from Edgar Allan Poe's life, is that alcoholism is very deadly and should never be the way that we deserve. We shouldn't take our life for granted, and we shouldn't drink to an extent. Of course, I don't really drink that much anymore. I really haven't been a big drinker in my life, but of course, learning something about it really does put you off sometimes. But of course, join us next time as we take a look into probably one of the scariest and most famous poems by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven. Of course, it will not be a really long video, but I'll try to give a bit of ambience to that. And of course, if you enjoy these readings, please feel free to leave a thumbs up. I'll be glad to do some more reading. I'm actually enjoying this. I've been doing a bit more reading lately. I've been reading some more comics and things. I know it's technically not reading, but we're reading this together, are we not? Of course, I do have some more books I do own that I'd like to read to you. I've got one Warhammer one, and I've got a American Civil War Bernard Cromwell book, of course, I'd like to read to you. But of course, if you want to see more, feel free to leave a comment below. And of course, subscribe if you're new around here. I'm really proud to keep bringing you new and exciting content. Of course, this is more of a relaxing video. And of course, if you want to see more, do all the above. And of course, I will see you in the next video. I will try to do some more continuing because I want to try and get this book read before I have to return it. So thanks for watching, and of course have a nice day, and I'll see you next time, and I will love you and you. It's time to go and kill some more people in Dynasty Warriors from one extreme to another. Take care, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.